Thank you very much, Professor Padoan, for this extremely interesting presentation. And we will move to the Q&A session, but if you allow me, I will ask the first question. The debate between the austerity, you mentioned this briefly, the debate between austerity and pro-growth policies have divided the member states of the European Union. But clearly now today, most people recognize that the biggest problem is unemployment in the EU. And we know that the unemployment rate in the EU has increased between 2008 and 2013, for example, from 7 to 10%. And unemployment rate for the young people is even higher, and in some member states, very high, like 25%. So the future of an entire generation is at stake. So we have this debate which is moving, evolving, as you mentioned and explained very clearly. And now we have the so-called Juncker's investment plan that should deliver more than 200 billion euros for additional investment in the next 3 years. But this plan assumes a very large participation of the private sector. There is a leverage of 1 to 15, €1 of public fund for 15 euros of private funds. Do you think that this can be achieved? What will be the response of the private sector? And why do we need to call on the private sector when the interest rates are so low and maybe the member states could borrow money, with the next question saying, could we imagine that the productive investment is not considered as a normal expenditure and is not accounted for in the national debt?
Thank you. I take that your question is about investment rather than unemployment. Okay. I don't want to escape the issue, of course. But let me start from the bottom. Well, let me start from the point you noticed, which is key. Well, how is it that with such an abundant liquidity, the private investment is lagging behind? Well, this to me signals clearly a market failure. Companies can decide to invest either short-term or can invest elsewhere. So why should we count on a Juncker plan? The way I understand the Juncker plan logic is exactly because there's a market failure and there is the need of public policy to fill the gap between the risk that the private sector is willing to take at the current conditions and the risk taking that's needed to start up long-term, especially long-term investment, including infrastructure and all that. So from that point of view, the face value logic of the Juncker plan is to fill that gap and to provide additional investment. Indeed, one of the basic principles that are discussed in the policy circles is how do we exactly provide additionality, and therefore how would the next mechanism of the Juncker plan, which will be run in conjunction by the Commission and the European Investment Bank, how will this allocation mechanism guarantee that we're actually putting money in additional projects? We will see. This is certainly one of the typical details where the devil sits very comfortably, which needs to be addressed. The other thing of the debate is that implicitly an answer to your last question is provided by those countries that say the issue in Europe is not money, but it's good projects. It's companies are not investing in spite of having no problem with liquidity because they see no profitable investment. So this, I think, well, my favorite response to that the discussion among colleagues would be you need both. Of course, it's a no-brainer. You need both resources and you need projects. So which means that basically, since resources are in the markets, you need mechanisms to redirect resources towards the appropriate allocation. So the question becomes, how do you generate profit opportunities? This is where the link between investment mechanisms such as the Juncker Plan, or more appropriately I should say European Strategic Investment Fund, the EFSI, come in and establish a link with another policy agenda which I mentioned very quickly, which is a structural adjustment agenda. Why should structural reforms help? Because in most cases, because they eliminate barriers to investment, so they make investment profitable where before that they were not profitable. This is a problem certainly that I see is very present in my country, in Italy, where for 20 years obstacles to investment of all kinds have been accumulating. So the structural reform agenda is, among other things, justified by the fact that it generates new investment opportunities. So this is the idea. You need resources, and you need to direct resources towards new investment opportunities. So you need the Juncker Plan, you need the EIB, and you need countries to introduce structural reforms, or you need the single market to make progress. Is this related to unemployment? Of course it is. But again, is unemployment large? For what reason? Certainly a large component is because of weak demand. There's no doubt about that. But of course, and this is where Europe is different from other parts of the world, the structural unemployment component is also very large. And by structural unemployment component, of course, one has in mind unemployment that's generated by impediments to hiring and firing. Again, my approach is that you need both sides of the coin. You need policies to boost aggregate demand, and you need policies to unleash investment and hiring opportunities. One final point related specifically to the Italian case. Governments can do a lot from that point of view. They can introduce structural reforms to change the way markets operate, and they can use the budget of public resources to boost the reform impetus. This is what we have done in Italy. We have introduced a major labor market reform, and we have put money, given our budget constraints, to support hiring incentives of companies by reducing the tax wedge and by making available fiscal incentives for hiring to companies according to the new contracts. So there is a scope for complementing structural reforms with budget policies that is promising, especially from the point of view of employment creation.
Thank you. Now, maybe I will open the floor to questions. We will take 2 questions because we don't have too much time. And please use the microphones. Introduce yourself and please make the question short. Don't make a long political statement or economic statement before your questions. So we have 2 questions there, please.
I can speak hard enough, maybe that's what you I have a question because you spoke of rebuilding trust, and that rebuilding trust is essential to the future of the European Monetary Union. And in that respect, I read the Financial Times, and I kind of wonder myself, because you said this, what your view would be on the visit of the Prime Minister Tsipras to Russia, the one day before it is to make a payment of 450 million euros to the IMF. And in that respect, because the article I read also spoke about it, which monetary implications you foresee if Greece would block an extension of the sanctions imposed by the European Union on Russia?
Can you have the second question first? And
yeah, mine is kind of related to that. One of the things that you've been talking about is the long-term European project, which I agree is a fantastic vision. The trouble with visions is that you have a habit of getting run over by the train that is 3 feet away.
Sorry, run over by?
By the train that is coming at you from 3 feet away. In this particular instance, the train is the voter, who, back to the point about trust, is obviously completely disengaged from the European project. And unless the voters across Europe, whether or not it's Greece, Italy, France, the UK, feels more engaged in that, then obviously the European project is meaningless. So from your perspective, how do you think that Europe needs to address that huge gap between bureaucracy and the voting public?
Thank you.
Very easy question.
Yeah. Well, the first question is concerned. Well, first of all, let me note in passing that the world is complicated, isn't it? But you appropriately raise the fact that there is a visit of Mr. Tsipras to Moscow by suggesting that one of the consequences might be that Greece, as a member of the European Union, might oppose, in a way or the other, towards the continuation of sanctions against Russia. So this, to me, reminds me of an obvious fact, and apologies for being so naive, that international relations are many-dimensional, not just one-dimensional. However, this to me says one thing, that Europe has a global responsibility, and that if there is a member of the European Union that would, but this is just intellectual speculation, would offer to a non-member of the European Union to change the policy of the European Union inside to favor that country, the European stance, not the national stance of national member states, is weak. So there is a lack of appropriate European policy vis-à-vis major crisis episodes, such as the Russia-Ukraine crisis you're alluding to. And so maybe Europe could have done better in some aspects, on the one hand. On the other hand, the obvious implication of that suggested option that Mr. Tsipras might offer would almost by definition strengthen the incentive for Greece to leave, and rather than to abide to obligations. And this, actually I was surprised there was no question on a Grexit story. This would also have systemic implications. It would signal that the option of further monetary integration is actually weaker than it is. If a country, any country, including Greece, were considering leaving the exit, and if other countries, which is not recalled whenever a Grexit option is mentioned, that other countries would welcome the fact that Greece would leave, because this would be the other side of the story. Greece cannot leave without other countries facilitating, in technical terms, political terms. This would signal again that the European project is weakening. If those two things happen, namely, let me recap, that Greece agrees to support Russia in weakening a European policy vis-à-vis sanctions, this would clearly signal that the European view and security policy is not strong enough, does not have enough consensus. Same story you can tell about the monetary exit. Again, this would signal that there is a weak European response. So my attitude would be, where have us Europeans gone wrong? This would be my attitude, not the fact that Mr. Tsipras decides to go and offer that bargain, which, by the way, I'm not sure that this is the case, but I'm not familiar with that. So this is not an answer to your point. Certainly, the examples you have raised signals once again that we have trust is in short supply. So that would reinforce my concern. I'm not happy about this, but I'm just taking note. On the gentleman's view, I can guess indirectly which country you're from, but...
I spent a lot of time in Singapore.
Yeah, that's not in contrast with... I think you are bluntly right. The fact that European voters are expressing their preferences for parties that are clearly against, certainly against the euro and to some extent against the European Union, signals one very worrying thing, that voters or citizens are increasingly disappointed with the European project. And they are right being disappointed, because Europe is seen, rightly or wrongly, as producing more unemployment rather than less. And it's putting into question the welfare system, which of course is not a European welfare system, it's a national collection of national, but it has a European inspiration. So this again leads me to a similar conclusion like the one with respect to the previous question. If we believe, like I do personally, that Europe still has a value, then we must be very critical vis-à-vis ourselves. We must revise deeply our project, and we go back to the first word you mentioned, unemployment. At the end of the day, Europe will be convincing and confidence will be strong to the extent that families will see job opportunities for their kids increasing, not decreasing. This is certainly right for Europe, it is certainly right for Italy. Confidence still needs to be stronger, and it will become stronger once we clearly see that job opportunities are improving. If we don't do that, let's face it, the European project is a failure. I have no doubt about that.
We might add also that the EU is extremely bad at communicating its successes and achievements. And we have a lot of work to do to outreach to the people and to explain what has been done by the EU for the sake of the European citizen. Can we move to the next round of, we have one question at the back there, and do we have a second question? Don't be shy. And we have a second question, the lady there. So the first in the back there, please.
The last point that only monetary unions that have survived the history are those that have become political unions. So are you implicitly making a prediction that the single currency is doomed?
And let's have the second question immediately.
There is a fear that Europe might follow the Japanese-style inflation. How long, I understand this structural reform and very in good direction, but how long do you feel to take to have a positive impact for the European economy? What kind of time frame?
Well, that's one possible outcome. The other possible outcome is that political union project, which has been at the beginning of the European story, is kept alive, realistically. Of course, I'm not, this contrast with the perceived speed of the political process and debate in many key countries. But at the end of the day, this must remain very well in the minds of current and future policymakers. And so this is way down in history, certainly beyond my lifetime, I guess. But this must remain a perspective. Otherwise, the incentives to make further integration, make further institution building, and make further mutualization simply weaken, and at some stage they will disappear. It's about keeping the incentives alive. You're asking how long will it take? Well, first of all, yes, there is a similarity between the Japanese style deflation and stagnation. Well, on the one hand, I would say that the European case, it's even more difficult because it has to overcome one additional obstacle, which is national fragmentation. You need to put in place policies that are not good only for one country, but they are good for a diversified yet integrated set of countries. And this makes, other things equal, the impact of policies less effective rather than more effective. So this is one problem. The other problem is that perhaps, but I stand to be contradicted, that the awareness in Europe of the risk of a Japanese, if I may use that expression, decade, as the awareness of those risks has come sooner. The fact that we are having QE is, to me, a sign of that. And perhaps if you compare the initial response that the Japanese authorities provided vis-à-vis the initial risks of deflation and a recession, was not as aggressive as it is today in terms of QE, and in the case of Japan, of Abenomics. So the policy awareness is different. This does not mean that it's going to be easier or quicker. But as I said, stagnation and deflation are results that signal complex problems. So my attitude would be, there is no silver bullet, you need a policy strategy, you need a policy mix. And I tried to list some of the components of that policy mix. Why do you need a policy mix? Not only because you need all the tools you can use, but also because there are synergies and interdependencies between different policy issues that reinforce or weaken the single instrument. One example is the relationship between the impact of structural measures and the macroeconomic cycle. We know, although evidence could be stronger, that if you liberalize a market, the benefits in terms of additional investment are stronger if the cycle is strengthening rather than otherwise. So if the cycle is strengthening because of QE, then reforms are expected to be more effective. This is one example. Maybe sounds a bit abstract, but it's one example. So if we are not too inefficient in using our policy toolkit, we do have in Europe the policy instruments to deal with the risk of stagnation and deflation, especially if we recognize that our problems, our European problems, date much further back than the beginning of the crisis. They date back at least 2 decades. I would place the beginning of the problem when the catching up vis-à-vis the US per capita GDP started to close and began to widen. That is, to me, an important element which did not catch the headlines, but to me proves that our problems in Europe date much further back than we think.
We have time for a last round of questions, and one question there and one in the back. Please use the microphone.
Okay, so you said if we cannot act on exchange rate and other tools are also cut out, we need to act on structural reforms or the labor market to improve the economic situation. So do you feel you have enough instruments, policy instruments, to materialize these structural reforms? And I tell you what I see. I mean, I see a lot of, I see more in place instruments like quantitative easing, very high level, when we know that structural issues in countries like Italy are far more at a lower level, so they are embedded in the bureaucracy and corruption. Do you feel the governments, they have enough instruments and tools to act on things that are embedded in the mind of 100,000s of bureaucrats, for example, there are in these countries?
100,000 of?
Bureaucrats and administrators, which have a mentality that's difficult to change. And what will be these tools more practical?
We have one last question at the back of the room, please.
My question is related, but on a much more micro level. We talked a lot about unemployment, and one of the big challenges of structural unemployment is skills becoming irrelevant. Even in Asia, we are struggling with some of these issues as we try and reskill workers to deal with the changes in technology and the globalization issue. Attitudes are a key issue in this. So what is your view of Europe's ability to transform skills and attitudes to deal with structural unemployment at the level of the worker, and what are you doing to address it?
Thank you. And I wish to add one very short question. When are we going to harmonize the tax systems to avoid fiscal concurrence between the member states that is being exploited by the multinationals to avoid paying tax? Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I like the comparison between QE and structural reforms. The easy answer to your question is that QE can happen in a few seconds. Structural reforms take, as you say correctly, implementation. And the debate, again, my experience is that A few months back, the debate was country X should introduce that reform. Now, country X has introduced the reform, and so the same person would say, now country X is to implement the reform. Taken, well taken. So how do you make structural reforms as fast as QE? You don't. But certainly, it is of the essence to introduce ways to assess the degree of implementation, and that has also different degrees of implementation itself. For instance, in the labor market reform in the case of Italy, the government has introduced implementing legislation. And once you have implementing legislation, you have to have all components of the public sector that are involved, such as the Social Security Agency, such as the Labor Ministry, such as the regional level agencies to get to work. So this is basically how you make the machine work towards implementing the structural reform. This is a huge task, and this is something which requires a day-by-day effort. Will the government succeed? Who knows? I hope so. But I fully take the point. The issue is implementation. However, there is one element which helps, which is related to the way Europe is implementing the new surveillance mechanism. The new surveillance mechanism, including the latest flexibility document, increases the incentives for governments to implement reforms. Also because the Commission looks at the details through which implementation takes place. And since this itself is a precondition for being passed at the exams at the Commission, there is a further incentives for governments to do implementation. This is not a silver bullet again, but helps. But I agree that that's the point. Skills transformation, well, this is a huge topic. This is about the skill mismatch in a global economy. And here I don't have easy answers. I certainly take that the point is relevant, and I have a very humble, tentative point to offer, which is the following. You have to go back to the education system, and you have to ask to what extent the education system is responding to not the current but the future needs of the economy in providing the appropriate skills. This is extremely difficult. This is one of the most difficult challenges. I have a little experience dating back to my OECD times, where the education analysis through the very different systems you're probably familiar with proved to be extremely complicated. But certainly this implies that investment in education in all countries must be improved not only in terms of resources, but also in terms of where you put the education money, which is a very difficult point. So I'm not answering to your point. I'm certainly agreeing that it's a very key point. On tax issues, well, first of all, one thing is providing a level playing field on tax issues. The other thing is providing tax harmonization. My view is that, first of all, you need to provide a level playing field. And in this area, let me remind that there's been significant progress very recently. For instance, the European Union countries have adopted and will implement by 2017 the standard, the new global standard for automatic exchange of information with respect to banking issues, which means that, and I can say this, the tax haven phase is gone. Certainly it's gone in Europe, it's increasingly gone globally, and this is a major step towards fighting tax evasion. Then you mentioned another area which is much more complicated, which is now at the top of the G20 agenda, which is so-called BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting, which tries to tackle the fact that, to use an OECD slogan, sorry for that, but that's my past job, we are moving away from a world where we avoid double taxation towards a world where we have to deal with double non-taxation. So we need to cope with the fact that taxes must be paid at least once, right? Not twice, but at least once. And so you need to build, and that's a very complicated issue, to build towards a common playing field as simple as possible, as fair as possible, which is the prerequisite for being effective in fighting tax evasion. So that would be my tentative answer there.
Thank you very much. I think we have to close here the session, and I would like to thank Minister Padoan for sharing with us all your experience, knowledge, and ideas about the Eurozone and about the monetary union. And please, can we all thank the Minister for sharing with us all those ideas. Thank you very much.